Jeremy, thank you very much for joining me. It's a real pleasure to have you with us. As I just mentioned, I want to start with some of the broader macro points. And when you see people make the argument that just simply because of where we are in the current market expansion, a decade on from the low, that should mean we're due a pullback, what do you say to that thought process?
I was really hoping there'd be a magnificent bubble ending to this, as there had been to the three great recent experiences, which were the housing bust, 2000 tech bust, and Japan. They were all classic. They ended with euphoria and a rapidly accelerating stock market. They're easy. You know they'll be followed by an abject decline. This one, I was hoping that would happen, doesn't look like it will, and therefore you're going to have a decline of a different nature. I wrote a paper 3 years ago called Not With a Bang But a Whimper, in which I suggested that the trend line PE that used to be 15 and has jumped for 20 years to 20 or 21, which is a lot higher, is probably not going to go back the way the value managers would love it to in a hurry. It may move back slowly and steadily, and I think it will move back perhaps 2/3 of the way, but it will take 20 years, not the usual 5, 6, or 7 years. And so this will be limping along, 3 steps down, 2 steps back. It's not a typical experience, but it looks increasingly likely to me.
And when we see that the Fed has pivoted and become, relatively speaking, more easy once again, and the ECB has done that too today, does that make you think that US equities are attractive for the next couple of years again?
No, I'm afraid not. You can't get blood out of a stone. They're at these prices. Even the bears, the bulls, and everyone in between at GMO agree that over a long horizon, like 20 years, US market will be delivering 2 or 3% real. And for the last 100 years, we're used to it delivering perhaps 6% real. So this is a fairly painful, it's not the end of the world, but it's going to break a lot of hearts when we're right. 3% a year is going to seem terribly disappointing. Now, if you stay away from the US, which I absolutely would, in emerging markets, I suspect you can do even better than 6, maybe 7 or 8 if you tilt it towards value.
And we'll come to emerging markets in a moment. Just back to the US, so that's your sort of 20-year forecast.
Yeah.
Your 5 or 6 year forecast is for actual declines in US equities, is that right?
I would think declines are more likely than the other, and if the market is up, it's highly unlikely to be up a lot. And I think that's the key thought.
And the main reason, what? Valuations of those stocks?
Valuations, and the fact that the economic cycle will clearly not be in our favor. The reason we've done so well for 10 years is we had an enormous pool of unemployed. This is not trend line growth. This is taking 1% a year almost out of the unemployed pool and sticking it into the marketplace. And that has boosted our apparent growth rate by almost a point a year. This economy does not have a trend line growth of 2.8 or 2.5. It has a trend line growth of about 1.5, and we've been boosting it on a cyclical basis. And people, if you keep anything up for 10 years in the stock market, people think it's a trend line, but it isn't.
And so on that topic of the economy rather than the markets in the US, do you fear a recession? Are there any signs you see that suggest one is on the horizon in the next year or so?
I think people have been worried about recessions for 2 or 3 years. I've taken the view that there was enough labor hiding in the participation rate. We had frightened people away out of the workforce, but on the numbers, they were there, lurking around somewhere. And in the last 2 or 3 years, we have quite effectively drawn back about 1.5%. People who were dismayed and weren't bothering now have registered and show up in the employed or the unemployed. And that game may still have 1.5 points left. And 1.5 points could keep us going for another couple of years. Or it could stop tomorrow. The point is, what we cannot do is we cannot grow at the speed we've grown for the last 10 years. Because the labor pool is simply not available, and the underlying productivity has not been there for a long time.
And what about the global growth outlook? Clearly fears about that had surfaced in the second half of last year. Do you feel like they're adequately priced in now, or is there...
One of my problems is I always like to think longer term apparently than anybody else, but which
and it served you very well, Jeremy.
Which can be inconvenient, but the growth rate of the population of the developed world has gone to hell, and the population eventually will start to decline in the next couple of decades everywhere in the developed world. You need 2.1% fertility rate to replace, and the US just announced 1.76, 15% below that. It's below in every developed country. This really has an effect on the top line numbers, and there's no way around that. It's not going to change ever, I would guess. So we have lower workforce growth, we have an aging population which doesn't help, and the growth rate of the whole developed world is settling down. Maybe 1.5 in the US, maybe 1 in Europe, much lower than people seem to get their brain around. And outside Europe, I think the population growth I am certain the population growth rate is also slowing. And so generally speaking, we can look at a world where the secular growth is getting slower. That's the long-term picture. Over the next 2 or 3 years, I suppose the honest statement is your guess is as good as mine.
Fair enough. And let's dive into Europe a little bit more. As we were discussing, the ECB has downgraded its growth forecast from 1.7 to 1.1%. Is there a bigger problem bubbling under the surface there? Could they face another existential crisis like they did in 2010 to 12 anytime soon?
The downgrading, by the way, is getting awfully close to what I think is their long-term growth rate, about 1. No one else believes that, but I'm pretty confident they will eventually. So they're going to have to learn to live with a low growth rate. They have, of course, other problems of immigration, which has been rattling the cage so viciously for the last 3 or 4 years politically. And that is highly unlikely to go away. Africa is the only place on the planet where the growth rate in population is still prodigious. And the UN says they're going to produce an extra 3 billion people. And the rest of the world will be declining. Now, there won't be 3 billion extra Africans, but there may well be 1, 1.5, or 2 billion. And there will be immigration waves that make the recent experience look trivial. And that's going to stress out the European politics. And I think that will be the biggest factor. And as they get stressed out, it produces opportunities for the big players, Russia or China, to misbehave or behave, but it increases uncertainty.
On the topic of Brexit, soon after the 2016 referendum result, you wrote in an op-ed or a comment piece that you thought there was a roughly 1 in 3 chance that the UK might end up turning over its decision somehow or some way. What would you say the chances of that
Isn't
today?
that amazing that 1 in 3 has kind of seemed about 1 in 3 right up until today?
Right.
I mean, how is that possible? Why haven't they made it 1 or 0 by now? It's every day seems to be a replay of the day before. It's Groundhog Day, writ large, Brexit. But I would guess, yes, it's a 1 in 3 chance that they'll have a revote and change their mind. I wish it were a 2 in 3.
And we were just talking about this. You're in fact going back to London and will likely be there for the 29th of March. Do you think that it gets delayed? Either way, is the chance of that higher even still? I'm
not an expert at this, so you tell me, but to a layman it looks highly likely 2 in 3 that it will be delayed. And maybe then, when it is delayed, the odds of a revote and a change of mind might rise a little bit from the 1 in 3.
Let's switch to something that I know you're optimistic about, and that is emerging markets. Your view, we talked about your expectation of a US equity market decline over the next 5 years. What about for emerging markets?
Yeah, I think emerging markets is the future. They have the people and faster growth, and increasingly they direct their efforts in a very intelligent way. China in particular is cranking out their percentage of people taking engineering and hard science. So they're now, in total, a much bigger country, but in total, massively outproducing the US in the number of engineers and scientists. And as that goes on, it makes it difficult for them not to take the lead in one area after another in science. And they are dedicating their resources to artificial intelligence. They've already dominated the green energy, wind and solar, in terms of manufacturing and installation. So they're becoming formidable competition. And India too, the fastest growing country in the world, that's now taking up the mantle of China. The developed world with its miserable growth rates has to compare with India growing at over 6% a year.
And on the topic of China, given those huge leaps, as you mentioned, it's made in science and innovation, is it now inevitable that it will one day be bigger than the US economy, or
yes,
not?
Completely inevitable. But what I should add about emerging is, in the end, after all these conversations, it always comes down to price. And they're always on average, they're a bit cheaper. They are much cheaper than normal. And their currencies are also cheaper than normal. I'm a great believer in the crude economist judge of inflation, the Big Mac index, as comparing quite effectively. It was a joke to start with, but 40 years later, it has 40 years of data and 60, 80 countries. And I think it's a pretty decent general idea of inflation and the currency comparative value. And we have very fancy currency comparisons in our firm and 1,000 other firms too. But I wouldn't hold my breath. I think the Big Mac index, the cost of buying a Big Mac and French fries in all the countries of the world, I wouldn't bet against that beating it. And what that says is it's always been 25% cheaper to buy a Big Mac in an emerging country, but now it's half price. And that movement back from 50 cents to 75% is a 50% move.
You mentioned that it's inevitable you think that the Chinese economy will be bigger than the US one day. What therefore
One day in the very near future.
How soon?
It's a matter of a handful of years. Depends what you're measuring and how you measure it.
And so what therefore do you think is the motivation for the current US trade war with China, and will it be successful?
I have to take the Fifth Amendment on this, or something like that. It's impossible to anticipate, to guess what the motives are of the current administration, which is what you're asking.
Well, what would the effectiveness
be then? I haven't the faintest idea.
It won't derail Chinese growth. It won't alter the balance of power, which is in a handful of years.
It may supremely irritate them and dislocate a quarter or two. In the long term, of course, this will all be forgotten and it's insignificant. That's the good news.
I'm interested that you're quite so bullish on China in this way, because you were mentioning how important you think demographics are. And China's demographics aren't now as attractive as somewhere like India's. Is that a concern for you?
Well, it depends what you mean by a concern. I consider a slowing growth in population our last best hope. I think if you want to end up as a sustainable world where you protect what's left of your biodiversity, you can't march irresistibly into the future with a growing population, each of us eating more and using up more plastic toys. It simply does not compute. And so I welcome declining populations, and India too will be declining in 50 years.
Let's talk about that, why you're saying that. And it's because you're so passionate about climate change and the environment. If there are a lot of unbelievers out there on this topic today, more so than perhaps there was a decade ago. If there's one statistic or story you point to convince people of their wrong position on that topic, what is it?
First of all, there aren't more today. Since the election of Trump, and particularly the last half of last year, there's been a big move in the recognition of the problem in the US. So that's a huge change. It's like a log jam that's broken. Plenty of hard-hitting reports. Finally, the scientists are saying what they actually believe, and the recognition of all of the fires and the terrible change in the weather and the climate, and people are picking that up. It's now 73% of Americans, up from 63 in a few years, recognize that the climate is an important issue and that it's warming and that it's dangerous.
And how do you affect real change? I know that you've donated over 90% of your wealth to the Grantham Foundation for the Protection of the Environment. GMO's also launched a climate change fund. To affect real change, does there need to be innovation that ultimately is also profitable in the long term rather than just goodwill?
Yes, I don't think goodwill will get this done, sadly. Homo sapiens is not rising to the occasion and maybe never would have done. Long-term issues are not what we do that well. So we need innovation. Luckily, there is a massive amount of innovation that bears directly on climate change, on green energy, on battery storage, electric cars, electric planes in the not too distant future. And we will be able to change for the better almost every area: cement, steel, petrochemicals. The question is only, can we do it fast enough to prevent damage? And the answer is no. We've already got a lot of damage. We will undoubtedly have a lot more damage. The question is, can we protect enough of our agreeable planet for our grandchildren to have a decent life? And that, I think, is about a 50-50 bet, seen through my eyes.
And do you feel like enough industries are doing all that they can when you see the financial industry moving towards...
No industry's doing all it can. No, nobody. I just took a damn plane to Chile, and I have a guilty conscience, and I'm struggling with my wife as to whether we can take that many more jet flights. I mean, yes, we plant forests all over the place, but still, it's a really tough ask of human beings to be as green as they could and should be.
So what is the one thing that everyone could be doing more? Is it donating some more of their...
You've got to have government. This is a big scale, big problem. You've got to have R&D, you've got to have government. The best thing that we can do as individuals is lobby our politicians to be more sensible. Let them be aware that the weight of our concern. And that's happening, particularly in Europe, with that wonderful young Swedish girl. But people are responding more now than they were. And that's what we have to do. We have to get our senators and our congressmen and lobby them in the hallways.
You mentioned you took a flight and you felt guilty about that. You drive a Tesla, though, so you don't need to feel guilty when you're in the car.
No, not very guilty.
Do you like Tesla stock, or is it?
No, I have nothing to do with Tesla stock, and never did. It's an extreme demonstration of growth, and I'm not saying it won't do well. There are stocks like Amazon that are always growth stocks and have done splendidly well. But I'm a value specialist, so it's not my kind of stock. But it is my kind of car. It's extremely entertaining to drive.
Just to round off on the climate change issue, you mentioned you felt there'd been big progress in the US in terms of people's understanding and backing of the cause. What do you think specifically about the latest development in the Green New Deal? And do you fear that there is now a left versus right politicization of an issue that you believe is apolitical?
There's certainly been a left-right division in the US for the last 15 years, which is really sad because most of the good environmental work was done by Republican presidents like Teddy Roosevelt and so on. And it's a real shame that has happened, and unnecessary, because conserving a beautiful planet would seem to be pretty conservative. And it hasn't played out that way for complicated and perhaps random reasons. And I've forgotten the rest of the question.
As in, has it become too political to an extent that it'll damage the cause?
The new proposals are too extreme to expect it to actually translate into any chance of implementation. However, when you have been drifting to the right for 50 years, it needs a good slap in the face to wake people up and begin the pendulum move back. And one way to state it is to take a big jump. So this is really drawing attention to the fact that we've had a remarkable drift. We end up in a world where the Environmental Protection Agency is run by coal lobbyists. I mean, 10 years ago, you couldn't have written a novel where things like that would have happened. It's so intrinsically unbelievable, horrific.
Some other progressive policies and announcements of recent weeks have seen, in different forms, a call for more taxes to be paid by the wealthy. Where do you stand on that? Do you think that is something that should be done, even if the exact mechanics of it are uncertain? Well,
I arrived in 1964, and America was a fairly equal place with fairly rapid mobility between socio-economic classes. And it's basically since 1975 gotten stickier, and now it's worse than the UK. I mean, who would have imagined that in 1964? And we have one of the most unequal countries in the developed world. We're not far short of the Brazils and Chiles and closing the gap. So we have a dreadfully unequal society where the average worker for an average hour's work has not made much increase in real income since the mid-1970s, for heaven's sake. And if you don't give the average worker a decent wage, where is your growth going to come from? This is, you know, you could quote Henry Ford. How are they going to buy my cars unless I pay them a decent wage? Well, we're falling foul of that. So if you need to distribute the income more evenly, and the concentration of income and wealth in particular in the top 0.01 and 0.1 and 1% has just alarmingly increased. It is amazingly economically ineffective. Rich people don't spend their marginal dollars. Poor people spend them instantly. You get a healthier economy if more of the pool goes to the poor than does today. So yes, you have to tax the better off, particularly the super rich.
One of the other philanthropic areas you're passionate about is a sort of truth issue, journalism and communication, and you've donated in that direction as well. How worrying to you is the trend of misinformation or fake news, whatever you want to call it? Is that as big a crisis as the environmental one in your mind at the moment?
No, I think the environmental one transcends everything. But I got to be an environmentalist the hard way by looking at the data and having it beat me on the head. I spent most of my life in America. I'm a Brit, but I spent 30 years notionally as a kind of centrist, the old liberal Republicans that went out of business long ago. And I'd vote for anybody with a green policy. But the data has become so extreme that just looking at the data has dragged me into tax the rich, move the income in a more efficient way so that the poor people have money to spend for a healthy economy, and for heaven's sake, tax carbon so that we can start the entrepreneurs working on changes. They're all itching, but they have no resources, and no one will fund them because it's not clear how they're going to make money. But once you have a tax on carbon and a credit for saving carbon, the ingenuity that will spring out of the American venture capital industry will be prodigious. American capitalism, I think, is in a rather bad spot. It's a bit lethargic and monopolistic and unentrepreneurial compared to the old days. But the great exception is venture capital. American venture capital is vigorous. It dominates the planet along with Israel, oddly. But there's a lot of hope if you can release the entrepreneurial and inventive spirit, and a carbon tax would do that.
To bring it back to the macro and the markets, Jeremy, as we round things off, is there one emerging market that stands out ahead of the rest for you on a 5 to 10 year view?
I really don't do that. But obviously, India has the fast growth and is a fairly stable society. So if you take a long 10, 20 year view, it's easy to imagine that will be hard to beat, and very few developed countries would do that. How China will play out, it's always hard to say. They have many advantages, and they can redirect capital in an area where they want to. But with the slowing population, their GDP growth will perhaps start to tail off. And who knows what will happen with that kind of government? I don't.
And a final question on the US. We've gone through your outlook of US equities. Even where you see value, as a value investor, the most famed value investor, do you still think that those value stocks within the S&P 500 will also underperform in the next 5 years?
I think they'll do less badly, but they're not cheap enough to do well. And you have to be very careful these days with what you mean by value. The old crude measures of value that used to work pre the year 2000 won't necessarily work. There are too many programmed into the computer models, and what edge they used to have, which was decent, has probably gone away. So you have to be very careful how you have to have a broad and complicated and accurate measure of value, and that's not easily done. It used to be you showed up for work, you bought the high yields and the low PEs, and you won. Life was good. And now you can't do that.
Jeremy, it's been a real pleasure sitting down with you today.
Same for me.
A treat for us, a treat for our viewers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.